Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. This webinar interview is another that we do in GlobalNet 21, and we do with Marina Finetto in a title called Conversations Across Borders, where we look at issues that affect different countries, global issues that impact on us all. And you know, in this particular webinar, we are going to look at a global issue that affects us all, and one that's going to affect us even more if we don't do something about it. And that's plastic pollution, and particularly in the oceans. And we've got Jo Ruxton with us today, who started Pacific Oceans. I think that's the name of the group, should tell us. And she moved from being a BBC producer to working in starting this whole project up, making documentaries about it, and sending a message across about the problem we've got. And I'm really pleased that she, you know, is here with us today and is going to join us. And Marina is going to interview Jo with me. So Jo, can I first ask you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background? I've briefly referred to it, but can you tell us a little bit more?
Yes, my career has kind of been, actually it's been many different roles, but maybe the main two have been in conservation. I was based in Hong Kong for 14 years and I worked for WWF, so started their marine conservation program there. And then I did a complete career change when I went to the BBC in 1997 to start working on the first Blue Planet series. So I then continued for another 12 years at the BBC Natural History Unit, making mostly underwater films, although I did throw an orangutan one in there. And then I kind of combined the two because I wanted to make a marine conservation documentary. And as a result of starting working on that, I then started the Plastic Oceans UK charity, initially to help raise the funds to make the film because I decided to make it just as the world plummeted into global recession and thought it would be easier. But also the more I found out about the topic and the inherent threat to human health, I didn't want the film to just finish with people viewing it and on to the next. I wanted the film to have a legacy. So by setting up the Plastic Oceans UK charity, we then continued that work through our education and sustainability programs.
Your passion for plastic started with a documentary, but how did the documentary start? How did you come up with this idea? What moved you into this topic?
That was an interesting way of phrasing it, my passion for plastic. It's certainly something that I would never have thought I would spend so many years working on. But when I was at the BBC, we were making incredibly beautiful documentaries and depicting the ocean as if it was very clean and that it was full of fish. And that wasn't what we were seeing when we were out filming. And I wanted to cover the other side of things, but it was always the same thing. No, we just need to entertain people. They don't want to know about bad news. And to me, I thought, well, it's a little bit irresponsible, because if people don't know about something, then how are they going to start caring about it? And I wanted to tell the whole picture. But the story with plastic is something to me that was so obvious to get across, and the solutions were so tangible. And one of the examples I'll give you was when we were filming for that original Blue Planet series, and we were filming pilot whales off the coast of southern Spain. And it's very windy along that strait, and it's where all of the winter vegetables are grown for the more northern parts of Europe. So winter salads and things, so lots of polytunnels. And with the wind, of course, the polythene becomes loose and it blows and it goes into the ocean. And it's about sort of a half-kilometre lengths of this stuff. And it kept happening when we were filming. And the pilot whales are very friendly animals and they'll come right up to the camera. But we were getting our legs tangled up in it. And you start to think, well, how is this going to affect them and other marine life? And, you know, I said, we need to get this into the story. But it was never going to happen. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that we'd been using plastic for, you know, decades and decades and calling it disposable. But plastic was designed not to decompose like other materials. It was designed to last forever. and yet we were making single-use items out of it. And the more I was out in the ocean, underwater, on the coast, on top of the water, the more I was seeing this. And I just thought, if I want to do a film that's got an ask at the end, then this is probably the easiest one to tackle, because really it's about awareness and habit change. So that's how it started.
So when you left the BBC and you became a freelancer, you turned to a documentary filmmaker. You're talking about the film you made. Have you made other films on that? Have you been able now to follow your passion by using film and video?
Only short ones. That film actually took 8 years from start to finish. So I would like to have said, oh yes, I've made 20 films in that time, but no, it was a very difficult process. It ended up costing more than £3 million, and raising those kinds of funds are very difficult. So it was a case of raising money, doing the shoot, trying to get more in, and then having a lot of the sequences ready to be cut, and not having the money for post-production. And that's even harder, because if you're not a filmmaker, you don't know just how bad raw footage looks. You know, we're used to seeing films with all the effects and beautifully cut to music and everything, but in the raw state they're pretty awful. So it was a very difficult process. But during that time, we were still running the education work and everything that we were doing with the foundation. So I thought at the time, because it was so hard, because I spent more than nearly 4 years without income, it was a very, very hard time. And I just said, I'm never gonna make another film. However, I have just started work on the next big one. So and we're still at the fundraising stage for that. But hopefully, because the other one has done pretty well, it's going to be an easier process despite the global situation.
Well, it did do pretty well, didn't it? And had an endorsement from David Attenborough, which is something really good.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it doesn't get much better than that, actually.
No, it doesn't.
He's been a real supporter. But the film's also been shown in parliaments around the world, and I know it's affected policy. And it was #1 on Netflix for a while, and #1 on iTunes. And I never dreamed that so many people would be interested in what essentially sounds like a very dull topic, plastic pollution. But actually, I think it's because it's so tangible. Everybody can see it. Everybody's getting a bit fed up with plastic packaging and seeing bottles and things in the environment, that I think the fact that it was delayed probably worked in our favor, because by then there was a build-up of interest in this, but people were feeling a bit frustrated about what to do. And the film does end with a series of solutions, but things have moved on since then, and the science has moved on as well. So there's certain solutions that are in there that I would recommend, different ones now, and also we're about to release another science document which brings all the science right up to date.
And this there are probably many people who have seen the film, but for the ones who have not seen it yet, what did you learn actually during this film, and what are the most relevant facts? Let's say, where does the plastic come from? And
yeah, well, I learned an awful lot, actually. One of the first things was that 80% of the plastic in the ocean comes from land. I think a lot of people think that it's dumped by ships, but it's not. And it's such an easy route for plastic to get into the environment. If you think about it, all of our streets are designed to drain rainwater. So anything that's dropped out of a car window on the street will eventually get into the drain. And that's a very easy route out into the ocean. But the big things that I learned, initially, the film was all going to be about the giant floating island of trash out in the North Pacific Ocean. And I'd read so much about it. It was twice the size of Texas, 3 times the size of Spain. It was 10 meters deep. And being a scientist at heart, I wanted proof. So I wanted to go there and see it. But in the research, I started to look for pictures, and I saw occasional pictures of tiny little single man boats, surrounded by plastic. And I'm thinking, well, that's not the center of the Pacific. He couldn't get that far in that boat. And also with scientists up on the International Space Station permanently, there's always somebody up there. why were they not beaming back pictures? If this was a new continent, a solid continent forming out there, why couldn't we see it? You know, you can see the Great Barrier Reef from space, and that's underwater, but there was nothing. And I managed to get on a scientific expedition, and there's a tiny piece about this in the film, to go out to the so-called Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And we had a month altogether, and what I found was so much more insidious, but as a filmmaker, very difficult to make interesting, because when you get there, apart from occasional floating pieces of plastic, you don't see much. The water looks as blue and beautiful as you can imagine, you know, a gorgeous ocean being. But what we were doing was putting a manta trawl in, so it's a plankton trawl across the top of the surface of the ocean. And we started 400 miles west of San Francisco. And when that first one came up, you know, seeing the contents of the net, I couldn't believe these little pieces of plastic. I thought it was horrific. But the closer we got to the center, every single net was absolutely choked with these microplastics. And that is far worse, because they're the same size as plankton. The plankton themselves were eating it, because plankton, often they've got little transparent bodies, and you could see what was inside. You could see they were eating the plastic. And that, of course, is the heart of the food chain. Exactly. So any fish that you have in the ocean is going to somewhere down the line have been eating the plastic. That was the biggest eye-opener. And I actually considered whether to turn the whole thing into a radio program, because I didn't know how to make nets of microplastics interesting. But then, of course, you know, thinking, well, of course, the most charismatic animal on the planet feeds on plankton. And then, you know, that was the blue whale shoot then started to come into my focus. And 2 years later, when we raised enough funds, we went off and filmed the blue whales. So that was one thing. But the other thing that I learned, well, two other things I learned on that trip. One was that plastic, when it leaves our coast, it takes about 20 years to get to the center of the ocean. And during that time, it becomes brittle, as all plastic does. So with the sunlight and the wave action and the salt water, it starts to break into very small pieces. And those are what you end up finding at the center of the ocean. But what you're seeing is nothing compared to what eventually goes down to the sea floor. 90% of all plastic is thought to be on the seabed, all plastic in the ocean. And it's, you know, mixed with the sediment at the bottom. So any contraptions to go and fish it out are not looking at the whole picture. You know, you can't dredge the sea floor, and imagine the damage you'd do if you did. So that was one. And the other important thing, which really rang alarm bells for me, was the chemicals that plastic attracts when it gets into the ocean. From day one, it starts to soak things up, like even things that were banned in the 70s, like DDT, can be found on plastic particles that are, you know, off the coast, because all the DDT, even though it was banned, it's still there, and it loves plastic, but it doesn't combine chemically with it. So if a fish eats it, you might think, well, I don't eat the guts of a fish. But what these chemicals like better than plastic is fat, so that they are released from the plastic, they're carried in the bloodstream, and they're stored in the fatty tissues of those animals that consume them. And these chemicals have been linked to all kinds of critical disease, including cancer and autoimmune disease, and then behavioral disorders and cognitive disorders. So there's so many, and endocrine disruption, of course. So there's so many different facets to this. And I thought, goodness me, if we make this film, we're going to get this message out, not just to the people that we know would watch a film about the ocean, you know, because that's a small amount of the population that, you know, would like to sit down and see that. This affects everybody. And that's why it's so important.
Did you also, when you got involved in this and you began to learn as you go along,
yes,
did you also get interested in how it might impact on biodiversity as well? Oh,
absolutely. Yes. I mean, that was things that we were seeing in the animals that we were filming as well. There's a sequence, there's two sequences on seabirds. We actually filmed 3, but it was just getting a bit seabird heavy. But the one that I think probably stands out for anyone that's watched the film was the shearwaters that were nesting on Lord Howe Island, which is a World Heritage Island. You know, it's a beautiful, pristine island. But these chicks are being fed plastic by their parents, who are going, you know, off into the ocean to find things, and they'll find things that reflect the light on the surface, which would normally be a little, fish scales and squid and things, but eating plastic, not digesting it, obviously, feeding it straight to the chicks. And there were so many that had died, so that, that could be an entire population that's affected. And those that survive, how many of the chemicals are they now carrying in their bloodstreams and in their tissues, which will then of course affect the next generation. And that's just kind of maybe a poster child for the issue. You can't see what's happening further down the food chain and how so many animals are going to be affected by it, and just what plastic will do to biodiversity, because everything in the ocean is so critically linked. Animals are so linked to each other. Everything works. But if you remove one or two of those, what happens? Who fills that space? And it's probably easiest to describe if you talk about taking out top predators like sharks. So if you remove the top predators, the animals that the sharks were kind of keeping numbers in control will suddenly blossom. And then there's way too many of those, which completely affect any layers below them. And then eventually the whole system collapses.
And it is also one topic that starts at least reaching out to people, is that if it is in the food chain of animals, it is in our food chain.
Exactly.
And as we are really connected to the oceans. And I read on your LinkedIn account that we aim to, you wrote it 2017.
I know, I really need to update it.
No, what you wrote, we aim to transform by 2020, we aim to transform how consumers, governments, and business view, use, and dispose of plastic. And, what has changed in your opinion during the last 10 years?
It's been amazing, actually. I started giving talks to schools right at the beginning, and I would go in there and it was like a new subject. The kids were fascinated. Children are amazing ambassadors for the ocean. They just soak up information and they think so diversely. It's amazing. It's always very rewarding to go and talk to children, and actually all school age. But it was a new subject to them and they were just so interested in it. But now when I go and do it, they know so much. It's incredible how that has turned around in 10 years. The artwork they've done, even the questions at the end have changed because it's gone a step beyond. It's very heartwarming, actually, to see that. The other thing is, nobody was talking about it when we started. We wanted to get other green groups involved, but other than a couple doing beach cleans, nobody wanted to be part of it. It was like, yeah, we've got our own programs. Yeah, we're cleaning beaches. It wasn't anything that anybody else was talking about. Same with governments. It was a new thing. And now, right around the world, there's new legislation. The awareness is phenomenal. And it's so many people are talking about all the green groups now tend to have somebody specifically working on plastics, and usually more than one person. And everybody's learning, and I think that's incredible. A lot more people getting on board with it. The other thing was the science. Originally, there weren't that many people who were actually looking at this as a subject, but it's absolutely everywhere now. So many people are looking at so many aspects of it. And I'm not sort of saying that the problem's solved, far from it. But I knew when I made the film, what I wanted to do was raise awareness, because I would never be able to solve it. But once people are aware, I knew all the clever people would get on board and start to look at solutions and what we could do and alternatives. Some of the alternatives I think are completely wrong-headed. But a lot of people are, trying to do the right thing. But the other things that we're seeing are, so many people addressing this, and also people choosing not to keep using single-use plastic. And that to me is what it's all about. Why is it that you've got to take a plastic bag or ask somebody to give you a paper bag if you don't want plastic? Why not just take a shopping bag? That's what we used to do. You had a shopping bag and you took it shopping.
But you made the film, you left the BBC, you made the film, you talked to kids in schools, you tried to create awareness. But what's the reason, one of the reasons that you started Pacific Ocean is you wanted to change that awareness into action. And, you know, how did you go about doing that yourself? Because awareness is something that's not easy to do, but it's easier than getting people to take the right action.
Well, the internet really helps. It really does. I mean, social media is such a very powerful tool that we all have access to these days. But the other thing I think really helps with this is actually having a film about it. You know, but by the time it was starting to become mainstream conversation, we'd already got the global overview, we'd already done it. And you can show people pictures, and I'll go back to the birds again because it's such a clear example. You can show people pictures of dead albatross chicks with their, you know, the rib cages open and plastic pieces. And that's pretty horrific. But if you actually show people somebody picking up the bird and then literally cutting it open and seeing the stomach and moving the stomach and seeing how rigid it is, and then actually opening it and seeing it, the actual moving images, the discussion, the sound of the person's voice who's obviously moved by what they're seeing, and the shock of seeing it almost in real time is so much more powerful than one picture that goes around. It's really made me realize that the film itself wasn't just about entertainment, although I know people have been entertained by it, but it was a real tool for awareness. And films themselves can create a movement, because if the film is produced specifically to go to a wide audience rather than being very deeply scientific, and you can bring a storyline into it, it can be very engaging because people are being entertained but actually being educated as they go. And the other thing is that you can use so many elements from that film to produce more education materials and get those out there. And the two sequences we didn't use, I use those stories a lot in my presentations.
I mean, there are, as you said, we are more aware. And my question is, are there big local differences or regional difference of awareness in the world? And are we really acting as much as we should, as long as we are aware about the problem? So are we moving fast enough?
No, we're not moving fast enough, but we've still moved faster than I thought. Just things like people taking their own coffee cups is going to have made a global difference. People understanding that your tap water is probably a lot better for you than anything that's been sitting in plastic bottles for a long time, absorbing all the chemicals from that plastic. Lots of people have got these, these nice steel. Oh, can you see it there? I've got a steel bottle. Let me put there. We are.
Oh, there you go.
Yes.
There's so many things that people can use that are becoming fashionable. I think that drinking your water out of a plastic bottle is one day going to be the same kind of thing as people who still smoke have to now go outside, and if it's raining, they kind of are there trying to get some shelter in the rain, but having to have a cigarette. And so many people think, why would you do that? Why would you start? That's where I see drinking out of a plastic becoming. It's going to be, why is that person drinking out of that plastic bottle? It's an interesting thing, actually. And one of the stories that brings it home was when we were filming in Tuvalu, which is a little island in the Pacific about 700 kilometers north of Fiji. The crew got stuck because there was a big cyclone in Fiji. So the crew was stuck for 10 days on this little island. By the time we got back to Fiji, there'd been the cyclone damage was considerable, and the groundwater had become contaminated, and a lot of people were sick because of that. But the aquifer where Fiji water comes from was not available to those people because they were exporting it mostly to America because it's the most popular bottled water that they have there. So you think about that. The local people can't get access to their own water. The water is put in a plastic bottle. It will sit in a hot dock in Fiji. So all the sunlight forcing those chemicals in, it'll then be transported 6,000 miles. It'll then go into warehouses and onto lorries and trucks and, moved around, and then sit on a supermarket shelf. How many months after it was originally taken? And then it'll be bought. Somebody will pay $4 for that and put it in their kitchen. And instead of walking across that same kitchen to turn on the tap where they have water that's clean, piped into their own kitchen, they will drink water that's come from Fiji. It's utter madness, and it's a marketing, I think it's a scam, honestly, trying to say that that water's better than the stuff that we get. It's just nonsense.
Yeah, well, I like the idea. If you want to drink out of a plastic bottle, go outside and do it. That we can promote. But I mean, time's going on and we're getting close to the end. Not quite yet, but I just wanted to give you some time to talk about Pacific Ocean and what that does and how you started it and what you hope to achieve.
Do you mean plastic oceans?
Plastic Ocean, not Pacific Ocean. That's a big ocean. Yeah, plastic oceans.
Yes. So we started initially to continue our work through education and sustainability. We are keep an eye on the website, which is plasticoceans.uk, and please go to .uk, otherwise you'll end up on a different one, which isn't us. And we're going to be rebranding in September, October, so look out for that. Yeah, we work with school groups, we work with businesses, we produce incredible education resources. If you have any teachers in your family, if you go to education.plasticoceans.uk, there is so much there, including film clips and all sorts of worksheets and things that are designed by teachers for teachers, and certainly the ones that those teachers that have been involved have said this is exactly what we're looking for. They don't have to spend their Sunday afternoons planning lessons for the coming week, because everything that they need is there. What we're building now is what we're calling a plastic intelligent framework, and what we want people to do is to understand why plastic is such an amazing material. We're not anti-plastic. In medicine, it has saved lives many times over. We are living with plastic, but we have to live intelligently with plastic. So we have to understand why it's good, why it's bad, what it does in the environment. But the other element that we're looking at is our connection with the oceans. Why is the ocean so important? And Nerina, right at the beginning, you were saying how the ocean provides the air that we breathe. More than 50% of the oxygen that we use has come from the ocean. Everyone talks about the forests being so important, which they are, but nothing in comparison to how much the ocean produces and how much CO2 it absorbs. So it is literally our life support system. And we've been turning our back on the oceans for years. So we've got 3 new films on there, which are 5-minuters, and one of them is about the ocean, one is about plastic, and one is about what plastic does in the environment. So it's all there, and those can be used by any groups that want to take them and show them. So there's an awful lot that we're doing, and we're looking at businesses as well to see how they can live sustainably with plastic and understand it and make all the changes. But we also understand that it's in our lives for good. And 2 of my granddaughters were born prematurely. One was very premature, and she was 11 weeks early, nearly 11 weeks early. And she was actually born into a plastic bag to prevent her from getting any infections on her way to the incubator. And then, of course, plastic tubing to feed her, to allow her to breathe, and to give her medication. And I actually, when I look at those 2 little girls now, I kind of think, would they be here if it wasn't for plastic? So, not to make it the enemy, use it where it's good, but just not to use it for ridiculous single-use things. Think of a coffee stirrer. You stir your coffee for a matter of seconds, and then that thing is going to be on the planet probably when your great-great-great-grandchildren are around. Yes. And then it'll probably turn into tiny pieces and never go away.
I think, as you pretty well described, we have to learn to use and not misuse everything we have. Yes. And we to understand how connected we are. Yes. To everything. Actually, it's not about only saving the ocean, it's about saving
humanity.
Everybody.
And not to think of recycling as that it's okay to use it because I can recycle it. Recycling with plastic tends to be downcycling. You can't keep recycling plastic like you can with aluminium, for example.
Yes.
Eventually, you're going to end up with the same amount of plastic, and it's hard and it's black and nobody wants it because you can't add color to it, and it just has very little use apart from park benches and things, but how many black park benches are we going to produce on this planet when you think the exponential way that we're producing plastic? We have to get that under control.
Sorry, it's gonna be my last question probably. It's not that easy to, as you explained, to get plastic out of the oceans, because it's not the battle, but it has a lot of microplastics.
Yes.
Is there, are there projects that you really see having a big future in this?
To take plastic out of the ocean?
Yes.
There's fishing for litter campaigns, and there's fishermen who are bringing broken nets back. The trouble is some of the nets are so enormous, they've got complete sort of micro systems with them. We tried to pull a huge one onto the boat when we were out in the North Pacific, and there were so many crabs and fish and bits of coral and things growing on it. You actually wonder how much damage you're doing. That's why we've always started at the other end. You can be cleaning up the ocean, you can be cleaning up beaches forever, but you've actually got to turn off the tap before you mop up the flood. So we're looking at why this plastic's being produced for certain things in the first place, and obviously to stop it getting into the environment. And it's not just the ocean. The ocean's like the final casualty. You know, I've seen cows in India eating plastic. I've talked to vets in the UAE who have got camels with boluses of plastic, a meter in diameter in their stomachs that's killed them, you know, because they're just eating plastic bags and things that are drifting across the desert.
Yeah.
So it's a massive thing, and it doesn't need to be a problem. We can address this, we can change, we can use different things, but we have to value what we've got. It's not all about let's replace this with some other thing that will eventually biodegrade, you know, and that's another whole thing to talk about, because most biodegradable plastics can do just as much damage, and they need, you know, heat and oxygen to biodegrade, and there's no separate waste stream for them. So where do you put them? If you put them in the plastic recycling, they'll contaminate it. You know, it's the single-use, valueless lifestyle that we've got to address and make the changes.
Okay. I mean, obviously, you've talked very eloquently about the problem and about some of the solutions and the impact it has on animal life, human life, and the planet. So if people were interested enough to want to find out more, and I'm sure many people will be, where would they go to contact you? What would they go to see?
If they go to plasticoceans.uk, and when we rebrand, we will move across to the new one automatically. And we have a hello@plasticoceans.uk account as well, if they've got specific questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much for doing that. I mean, that was really interesting, because you told a story, not just about plastics in the oceans, but about your story and how you got into it, and how you moved from being in the BBC to making documentaries to starting the group Plastic Oceans, not Pacific Oceans, Plastic Oceans that you have. And, you know, I think that's really interesting. So thank you very much for joining us. I think it's been a pleasure. Lovely to meet you both. Well, it's been a great interview, and it's been really interesting. So thanks. So we'll end this interview now.